Ian, on this week's show, is there any chance we could go behind the scenes and talk to the legal team at Private Eye?
I don't think that's a good idea.
Page 94, the Private Eye podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Page 94. My name is Andrew Hunter-Murray, and this week has been a very exciting week for world news. As we record this, Russia and Turkey are engaged in a tense standoff. So if you're listening before World War III breaks out, then do enjoy your remaining time. If you're listening afterwards, then I'm afraid we can't do refunds on subscriptions. This week, we'll be talking to two of Private Eye's most important structural underpinning members, one of whom is our architecture correspondent, Piloty, who has explicitly told me that metaphor does not work. And the second is Robin, the head of Private Eye's extensive legal team. We start off with Piloty, and I began by asking him what Private Eye's architecture correspondent even does anyway.
Well, my brief is anything vaguely to do with architecture and outrages. To do with buildings. I mean, the column is properly called Nooks and Corners of the New Barbarism. That was the original title when Betjeman did it. And that's really what it still is, in a way. Everybody calls it Nooks and Crannies, but it isn't Nooks and Crannies. It's always been Nooks and Corners. And I suppose it must have been Tony Rushton who produced that sort of the Victorian rustic lettering, which always appears at the top. Betjeman began it in, I think, 1971. He poked fun at various modern buildings, and then I think got bored after 8 issues. It was then taken on by his daughter, the late lamented Candida Lycett Green, and that photographer did it for a time, and then it just lapsed. And round about 1981, Richard Ingrams wanted to revive it, and he asked John Betjeman, who I knew, and Betjeman recommended me. And to my amazement, I've done it ever since.
Are you an architect?
No, I'm not an architect, no.
Okay.
I'm sort of historian, architectural historian, and writer.
This is not intended as criticism. It's one of the more depressing columns in the Eye, because every fortnight it's this beautiful building's going to be torn down, this has been botched.
It's very depressing, and all this stuff comes in with ridiculous things that people do and outrageous behaviour by developers or councils. Yes, it is, which is why the occasional joke is good, and the occasional good story where the Eye has been on the right side. Often we have supported local campaigns, and that really matters. I suspect that what I say in the sort of London context, they just brush Private Eye aside. But when a local scandal appears in Private Eye, I think it's a huge asset to local amenity groups and societies all over Britain. I remember in particular one campaign I was keen to help with, and I gather afterwards very much the Private Eye combined with local people was over building on the Glebe outside Ely Cathedral. That went on for some time.
What's Glebe?
Well, it was owned by the church.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it was an open space, and still is, or part of it is. And there was a local group, but Nooks and Corners supported their campaign, and that was a good victory.
Are there ever stories where it seems to be really on a knife edge to you, whether which side is in the right? Some developments that might be necessary, some which...
Oh, yes. I try to see both sides. Obviously, prejudice comes into it to some extent, as it always must. And one gets to, I hope I've developed over a long period the skill of knowing which are the letters that come in from lunatics. It was easier when letters came in, you can always tell. Sometimes it's more difficult with emails, but you soon realise people who are obsessed, and it's just an extreme case of NIMBYism.
You don't get green ink in emails.
No, quite.
You've written a fair bit about the high buildings going up. For example, in London, this is a particular trend at the moment.
Yes. Well, a complete lack of any control. And the mayor, this mayor, and of course his predecessor, both have sort of applauded this and let far too much happen. And the damage is done, really, I'm afraid.
Even if the buildings haven't gone up yet, they've been approved.
Yes, some have been approved, and an awful lot are going up already.
Yeah.
I mean, one can poke fun. I mean, it's difficult with the column to make a sort of general point about policy or a whole area, but I've tried occasionally, such as over all the things that are happening in Battersea. I had to go, I remember once, suddenly that area, which was just partly derelict, and Battersea Dogs Home and Nine Elms Market was up for grabs with huge developments, which of course are all going up now, the area being utterly changed.
Yeah. What bears on your judgment over whether you think a development might be a good thing, a bad thing, somewhere in between?
Well, it's a subjective thing. It's a matter of whether there's any sort of decent architect or planner involved, and the nature of the opposition. I mean, when there's a serious local group objecting to too dense a development, lack of affordable housing, or just the height, I think there's a case for voicing a criticism. I think the strength of private eye is, of course, as in all other spheres, it's really independent. I mean, architectural correspondent, thank goodness, I'm not an architectural correspondent, attached to newspapers, because they're always, in a way, tied. Really, I realised early on it's a huge mistake ever to meet architects, because they take you out to lunch and the rest of it, and then they think they own you. Because the architects are always charming, even the worst of them. Charm is their speciality, that's how they get work. And once you've met them and had a drink with them or lunch with them, you had it. So it's very important to keep entirely separate from the architectural world.
Do they still?
So then you can insult them.
Do they still try these
Not
days?
with me, but
No.
I mean, there was a time when I tried to be a serious architectural correspondent on a newspaper. I was a huge failure at it. But I realised then, great mistake, to get to know people. I have sometimes said, of course, the best architects are dead ones. I mean, without being silly about it, at least then you can be objective about what they've done.
They're never going to try and take you out to lunch.
No, quite. Or sue.
Another thing I wanted to ask about is the Hugh Casson Award, which you started.
I certainly started. Of course, Hugh Casson was a very talented architect and the mastermind behind the Festival of Britain, the architectural side, and with his partner Neville Conder, put up some rather interesting buildings back in the 1950s and 60s. One does have hobby horses, and there have been people I've had it in for a long time, and he was one of them. Mainly because he was one of what the term, isn't it? He was sort of gamekeeper turned poacher, or the other way round. But he was a very interesting, talented man, founder member of the Victorian Society. But as he got older, he would turn up, take a fee for giving evidence at public inquiries to recommend the demolition of buildings, a trade I despise, though lots of people are doing it. And he would use as one of his qualifications, I'm vice president of the Victorian Society, arguing for the demolition of Victorian buildings. And it came to a head over, I think, Liverpool Street Station back in the 80s, when the Society had actually had enough, and he resigned as vice chairman just before the Society would ask him to go. But it was just hypocrisy, and I thought after that I would have it in for him, and so I waged unceasing war on him, and I thought the best way to ridicule him was by having the medal for the worst building of the year named after him, and then using one of his own sketches of himself on the medal. And I'm unrepentant. I think I may have made his last years, he may have been, I don't know, irritated, saddened by this, or perhaps he wasn't getting the fees in, but I'm unrepentant because he shouldn't have behaved the way he did. He didn't need to.
Are there any particularly egregious winners of the Hugh Casson Award?
Well, I think one of the most obvious winners was that ridiculous skyscraper in the City of London that lurches outwards and melts motor cars parked in the street outside, so-called walkie-talkie building. I hate all these nicknames. By an Argentinian-American called Raphael Vignoli, who's sort of risen without trace. It's a terrible building. And I think 2 years later, or a year later, it was given the Carbuncle Award by Building Design, but we got in first. But it was an obvious example of a really terrible building that shouldn't have gone up.
I walked past it the other day, and in front of you, as it looms up in the background, there are some, I think, Georgian buildings. They're about 3 stories high. They're very gorgeous. And then behind it, you've got this enormous building. Yeah.
It's not just the size. The fact that I do think, in the end, any building that's satisfying follows not the logic, but the necessity of gravity, the existence of gravity, and looks if it's rooted to the ground. That building sort of curves outwards in a way which I think is both ugly and I think distressing physically, which is why it deserved the prize. Of course, and I gather that Vignoli did another building in California where the same effect, of course, by having the start curving outward, they're what was the word? They're concave, and having this effect of concentrating the sun's rays. So the car melting quality had already occurred on one of his other buildings.
There are some good buildings going up across the country today, aren't there? From the column, it sometimes seems like there's nothing.
When I think back to when the column started, or before, when Betjeman started the column in 1971, architecture is infinitely better now than it was.
Really?
Oh, I think much, much, much better. Not just because there was a whole postmodern business and a return to tradition, though that had something to do with it. They're just, I think they're better made now. And that sort of culture of producing cheap buildings for a short life, just using reinforced concrete and plate glass or sheets of glass in a simple, crude way, that's gone. Buildings, I think, are much more sophisticated now. The general look, I think, even of housing, of most commercial buildings using brick as well as concrete of a structure or steel of structure. Oh, things have got much better.
Well, that's reassuring, at least.
There are still some awful things like that. Far too much glass. So often architects just reach for the glass catalogue when they don't know quite what to do.
You write a lot about places like, for example, English heritage.
Well, yes, the state of conservation, I think, is worrying because for a decade now, the absolutely necessary statutory body full of expertise on matters of historic architecture and planning, historic England, formerly English heritage, has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed by governments that couldn't care less. And that is a great worry. There are very good people in it, but they're lent on politically and starved of funds, which makes their job more and more difficult.
You don't really think of conservation being a governmental responsibility, I suppose. Obviously, it is at root.
Historic England has this odd status. It is funded by government, though it's independent. They recommend listing of buildings, but ultimately it is the minister or the Department of Culture, Media and Sport that actually does the listing. They make the recommendations. And it will be Historic England that gives evidence to public inquiry, that sort of thing. So they have an odd status. And if I occasionally have, I think one of their decisions is wrong, I will say so in Nooks and Corners.
Are you optimistic about the state of conservation in architecture? From the column, I would have guessed not, but I'm not sure now.
The way things are going with the government that say want to relax the planning laws, it's all in favour of development that couldn't care less about environmental issues. It's all very depressing. The encouraging thing is, there are very good people in the organisations and the conservation societies, the Victorian Society and Save Britain's Heritage, really good people involved, and people care. Cameron goes on about the big society. The big society has existed in England for centuries, and it's people like the Victorian Society and all the local amenity societies and all the rest of it who fight for things. That's the big society. And often they're fighting, of course, a monster.
Pilotti there, or to give him his real name, Gavin Stamp. Now, we turn to the legal side of things at Private Eye. I wanted to secure an interview with Robin Shaw, Private Eye's in-house lawyer, and after a great deal of wrangling and compromising with the powers that be, I was able to secure an interview, which is very exciting. Normally, when you interview the editor of somewhere, they might have a lawyer sitting in to check up on what they're saying. This week, the editor is sitting in on our interview with the lawyer. We started by talking about one of the most illustrious cases in Private Eye's legal history, that of Arkell v Prestram. And here is Ian's take on the matter.
Arkell versus Prestram was a very early Private Eye case, which was brought against my predecessor, Richard Ingram's. And a letter arrived from Arkell's solicitors saying that they would consider the amount of damages as proportionate to the response received from Private Eye. And the response my predecessor gave was fuck off. And he wondered whether that would influence the nature of their proceedings. So it became a sort of shorthand. I would certainly never use it. That's not true.
It's been in the mag within the last month, I'm sure.
OK, look, I've got the lawyer here to correct me. I think you as well.
Robin, you are the lawyer with possibly the hardest job in Britain among lawyers. Is that fair?
Well, that's certainly what a lot of people tell me, although, in fact, I find it rather enjoyable and not normally too demanding, but there are certain times that it can be quite tricky.
The word lucrative hasn't been put in, Robin, has it?
Well, that's not a word I'm not familiar with when it comes to myself. Certainly in a good deal of the copy that we write about in certain firms, that is criticism that we might make.
So the one story that's just come in fact, came in just after the latest magazine went to print, was about Tim Yeo MP, who's a Conservative MP who has just been suing the Sunday Times under the auspices of the firm he hired, Carter Ruck, who are not unknown to the eye, I think.
They certainly are not in a number of different ways. But the sad news today is that Carter Ruck's client, Mr. Yeo, has lost his libel claim against the Sunday Times. The sadder news is that Carter Ruck were acting on a conditional fee arrangement, which in effect means no win, no fee. So the consequence is that they will not be paid a single penny for any of their work on the case. The Eye did draw attention earlier this year to the amount of fees they were hoping to charge, which was about £500,000 at that stage, and that's before they'd put on their markup for taking on the risk of winning the case. So no doubt they were looking forward and rubbing their hands at the prospect of picking up around £1 million if their client has won. But so say the sad news is that they'll in fact not be earning a penny out of the case.
Can I just say that Robin's mispronouncing the name of the firm deliberately? I don't know why.
Yeah, sorry, we'll call it by its proper name, Carter Fuck, from now on in this conversation. Like, very long history between the Eye and Carter Fuck, as in stretching back to 80s, 70s?
I think it probably goes back to the 60s or the 70s, because Mr. Carter-Ruck, sadly now no longer with us, was around, I imagine, from the 40s onwards.
I should say, in Robin's favour, there was quite a lot of contact before Robin was appointed with the original Peter Carter Fuck, who once actually, he rang Private Eye and said, "I do not want to appear in your pathetic magazine as Peter Carter, and could you make sure this doesn't happen again?" I said, "Absolutely, Peter." And in the next issue, he appeared as Peter Farter Cuck. It was a suitably grown-up response.
So what does the job of being Private Eye's in-house lawyer actually entail?
Well, this is, of course, highly confidential matters, so I will speak until I'm told to be quiet by the editor. But in essence, what my job involves is coming and looking at the copy before publication and going through it all and raising any queries with the journalists or Ian, as may be appropriate. And then, after that process, dealing with any claims, complaints or other issues that might arise after publication.
Of which there may or may not be any, obviously.
There may or may not be any. Some people think that there's a terrible conflict of interest involved in all that, because it must be my interest to let through as many libels and as possible, and I'm in the happy position that so far Ian has never come and accused me of letting anything through that I shouldn't have done. But in fact, I'd like to think, as of course all of us lawyers do, a highly moral and ethical approach to such matters and resist that temptation.
It's only just struck me that it's a conflict of interest.
Let's assume for just a moment that the magazine has gone to print and for some reason, for some spurious reason, someone has taken exception to something that's been said about them in the mag, and they've asked their lawyer to write a letter to the Eye threatening all sorts of dire consequences. What's the next step?
The next step is to put together a letter of response to the complaint. Obviously, the nature of the response slightly depends on whether or not there's any substance to the claim. And a lot of cases, the view is taken that is, in fact, in reality, no substance to this claim. It's either just a try-on or a misconceived attempt to try and stop the Eye writing any further about the subject. And so in those cases, the normal approach is to write a pretty robust response.
So would that be a polite response in the vein of Arkell v. Prestram?
Oh, I suppose that might be the substance of it, although lawyers, of course, express themselves in slightly different language.
There are also stories about the Eye's long feud which went on with Robert Maxwell, and there are lots of very entertaining stories about, was it Peter Cook turning up in court and waving his chequebook at Maxwell after lunch and things like that?
Well, again, I think that's slightly before my time, but the Maxwell issues continued even after his death in the context of the trial of his two sons, now about 20 years ago, because one of the first issues that arose after I started doing the Eye was when Ian was summoned to appear before Mr. Justice Phillips down at the courts in Chancery Lane, where the son's trial was taking place over the issue of the Eye that had come out the day before, because it had made the astonishing and highly controversial suggestion that Robert Maxwell was dishonest.
It was a perfectly innocent piece saying that he'd arrived in hell and been made very, very welcome, and he was enjoying himself. And it was a fairly traditional, satirical piece about what happens to someone after death, and I thought it was entirely justifiable.
Well, Mr. Justice Phillips thought precisely the opposite. And so we duly appeared, waiting to see what he was going to say about it all, and he sat there looking very stern. and was snapping away at the counsel we'd instructed. But then our counsel pointed out that a supposed warning letter that had been sent round by the Attorney General's office about what one could or could not write about the Maxwell trial had been sent to every institution in the land apart from Private Eye. Because typical civil servant bureaucracy had overlooked the one publication with whom he'd had the most battles of all during his life, including, of course, the case that went to trial a few years before. And Mr. Justice Phillips, much to his obvious ire, had to accept that that was the case. And so, therefore, there was very little, if anything, he could do about the Eye, apart from looking stern and accepting an assurance that, of course, the Eye would never publish anything to this similar effect in the future. And that was that.
And that was contempt of court?
Yes, and that I should have said that the reason we were there was because the Eye was supposedly in contempt of court, which is another area that I, as the Eye lawyer, have to be particularly wary about, because Ian is under warning, albeit now of some antiquity, that if he overstepped the mark again, the courts might...
This is very old, this warning. I'm sure it's not current.
What exactly is the warning? What does the warning consist of?
This is Sonia Sutcliffe, who is the wife of the Yorkshire Ripper. I mean, we're going back decades here. I'm sure this is all irrelevant.
Well, I'd like to think that it was, but on the other hand, it's an expensive process to go down to contempt of court and have trials aborted because you've put your foot in it, as it were. So, still a very germane subject. Indeed, only last week, Condé Nast magazine were... well, they've yet to be found. Anyway, found guilty of contempt for what they wrote in the midst of the Rebecca Brooks phone hacking trial.
Yes, my principal concern is obviously not whether this ancient warning will come and get me, but contempt of court makes you look a complete idiot if you collapse someone else's trial, particularly if you want them to be found guilty and to go down. So the idea of interfering in a trial by writing the wrong thing is one of Robin's obviously main jobs, whatever else he's doing.
Well, I want to ask so much more. So, for example, can you say anything about how often the Eye gets sued these days? As a reputation, Ian is supposedly the most sued man in British legal history.
Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by sued. In the sense of sued meaning actually going to issue writs, then they are relatively few these days. And in terms of claims or complaints by letter which need to be resolved, then those are much more frequent. So Ian, I think, may be the most complained about person in the country, but not necessarily the most sued person at the moment.
The 80s are traditionally known as the bad old days or good old days of libel, depending on which place you're looking at it from. But the laws have changed recently, haven't they? They
have changed very recently, but going back slightly further, they did change also in the context of damages. And of course, the Eye were heavily involved in the Sonia Sutcliffe case, where the jury had awarded, I think it was $500,000 or some 600,000, some very, very high figure, which I think was really the breaking point in the public mind as to matters getting completely out of control. And so there were a series of cases in the Court of Appeal, of which that was one, which had the effect of reducing damages very, very dramatically. And so that removed the main incentive of people who sued for libel, namely lining their pockets with libel damages. But more recently, the Defamation Act of 2013, which came to force at the beginning of last year, has also changed the law to make it much more difficult to bring a libel claim in the first place. So that has had also a depressing effect on the libel market. I mean, it has to be said that a lot of lawyers have done very well, thank you very much, out of the phone hacking litigation, and so they've diverted their attention to that in recent years and are prolonging that for as long as they conceivably can. But certainly the libel front, where the Eye is possibly most vulnerable, has decreased a lot.
That sounds tentatively like a good thing, and like there are fewer problems for the Eye these days.
Certainly, I think, compared to the days of the 80s, where there was probably 10, 15, 20 claims in court going on at any particular moment, I mean, proceeding to trial, yes, it's had a dramatic effect.
There still seemed to be quite a lot of trouble with confidentiality and these other new areas that that you've brought up and advised on?
Well, confidentiality has partly replaced libel because of the effect of the human rights legislation that came into force a decade or so ago. And that reached its heights in the super injunction era of a couple of years ago now, when every day of the week super injunctions are being granted. At least one heard by rumour, of course, because one wasn't allowed to know strictly that was happening. But, of course, that took a bit of a hit in the Ryan Giggs case, and obviously the social media has made it virtually impossible to impose any blanket bans on anything. The Eye itself got involved in that super injunction case, and Andrew Marr's involvement with a journalist, because the Eye were informed by his lawyers that Marr had an injunction, and then fought a long battle to actually get Marr to back down from the injunction he'd claimed, on the footing that Marr, as a journalist, should not be seeking to injunct matters of interest. And eventually the Eye succeeded in doing that, and so the story emerged.
Can I just say the story emerged when he told the Mail? So all the money that I'd paid, well, a lot of it to you, obviously, to fight this injunction resulted in not a huge amount.
Yes, although there was another occasion where I fear you paid even more money, where a former president of the Law Society tried to stop the Eye publishing a story about a reprimand he'd received from the Law Society, which governs the solicitor's profession. And that was even more surprising because this person was himself in charge of or a member of the body of the main regulator of the legal profession. But he took the Eye to court and on appeal and lost both times round, and ended up with an enormous bill, and then had to resign from his position because it was simply no longer tenable. So in that case, the Eye did manage to get the benefit of the story, as I recall.
Are there any especially egregious examples of people trying it on where you think this is so spurious, there's no legal background for this whatsoever?
Well, I think that the most memorable one was when the Barclay brothers complained about an article that appeared in the joke pages of the Eye.
We should say Weirdo Twins, the Barclay brothers, as their official name in private eye. Yeah, so the Barclay brothers who own the Telegraph, the Ritz, and various other things.
Yes, and it was an article in the joke pages about their approach to paying taxes, and that led to, on the face of it, a serious letter of complaint written by their distinguished city lawyers, demanding retractions and apologies and all the rest of it. Now, I mean, anyone with a supposed brain in their head must have realised, looking at the Eye, that this was a joke piece, because it was next to the Cameron Weekly description of the events going on at the school of which he was supposedly headmaster, and other joke items, but that simply had escaped them. So we wrote back at some length, drawing attention indeed to cases involving the Daily Telegraph, where they defended cases on the footing that the article was not serious. And that was the last we ever heard of them.
Until after this podcast, presumably, when they'll return to the fray.
So, as Private Eye's lawyer, are there any particularly interesting cases that are going on right now?
Well, it's a very interesting case involving
No, there aren't. No, there aren't, Robin. There are no interesting cases going on.
OK, I appreciate I can't ask that. Can you tell me if the Eye has a contingency fund for fighting these kind of lawsuits? And if so, what's the approximate size of it?
Well, in accordance with my advice, I've suggested that...
I don't think we want to hear any of this. I don't think it's of any interest. I really don't see the point of this. Do you, Robin?
Well,
no. You see? There we go. Well, thanks very much for coming in. That's really good of you.
The recently fired Private Eye lawyer Robin Shaw there, and we thank him for his many years of service to the magazine. So, that's it. We will see you next time with another episode. Goodbye.